One other factoring technique is called factor by grouping. Now, factor by grouping is going to be used mainly when something is not quadratic. So in other words, when the biggest degree of a term is bigger than 2, so like this one as an example of a cubic because it's a degree of 3. Another huge indicator when you're going to use factor by grouping is more than 3 terms. So for this first example, we notice that not only is it not quadratic because of our degree of 3, we notice that there are 4 terms. So we're not going to be able to factor everything. There's no GCF out of every single term. So what we're going to do is we're going to group it. We're going to group the first 2 terms, and then we'll group the last 2 terms. Now I like to leave that sign in between them out. It'll help us later. So the first thing I'm going to do is look at the first grouping and ask myself, what's the GCF of 3x to the third and negative 4x squared? Well, all they have in common is x squared. So if I take an x squared away from everybody, I would be left with 3x minus 4. Now on to my next grouping. What is the GCF of 15x and negative 20? Well, the only thing that they have in common is a 5. So I'm going to put their GCF there. And then if I factor out a 5 from 15x, I'm left with 3x, and then a 5 out of negative 20 brings me with a negative 4. Now, this is a critical check-in point. What we need to notice is that what's in parentheses is the same. If it's not the same, that means you did something wrong. So our next step is noticing that we have 2 different things. We have 2 different numbers. We have x squared and positive 5 both being multiplied by the same thing. So what we can do is say this 3x minus 4 is going to be multiplied by x squared and positive 5. So that is our final factorization. Another example to factor here using factor by grouping, again because we can see that it's not quadratic and there are more than 3 terms. Now the big thing I'm trying to draw your attention to here is this is going to be a minus sign. So when we factor by grouping, there is no GCF for every single term, so we're going to group the first 2 terms together, and then we're going to group the last 2 terms together. And as I mentioned before, my method, I like to keep that sign in between them left out, and now it's a negative. So the first grouping, what does 3x cubed and 15x squared have in common? Well, 3 and 15 both have a 3 in common. X squared and x cubed both have x squared in common. So after I factor that out, I'd be left with an x minus 5. Now over here, it's very important to note that this is a negative sign. So when I ask for the GCF of 5x and 25, it's a 5. But since this is a negative, I have to think about when I distribute it back, when I take this number and distribute it back, it's actually a negative 5 now. We can't forget that negative. This is actually a negative 5. So if I factor out a negative 5 from these, what would I be left with? Well, negative 5x divided by negative 5 would be x, and then 25 divided by negative 5 would be negative 5. Now as our check-in, we can see that what is in both parentheses is exactly the same. If they weren't the same, it means we messed up, and I would probably point you back to that negative. So our common factor is x minus 5. And what is x minus 5 going to be multiplied against? Well, it'll be multiplied by 3x squared right here, and it'll also be multiplied by negative 5. And that is our final factorization.